Imagine being just 14 years old, a child with your whole life ahead of you, and suddenly you're accused of a crime so brutal, so horrifying, that it shakes an entire town to its core. Now, imagine being sentenced to death for a crime you didn't commit and then executed, despite overwhelming evidence that you were innocent. George Stinney Jr. was the youngest person ever executed in the United States in the 20th century. But was he guilty? Or was he the victim of a system so broken it couldn't tell the difference between innocence and guilt? On March 23, 1944, in the small town of Alcolu, South Carolina, the bodies of two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, aged 11, and Mary Emma Thames, aged 7, were discovered brutally. They had been beaten, their bodies discarded in a ditch. The town was in shock, desperate for answers. The town was in the grips of fear and anger, and the search for the murderer began immediately. The girls had last been seen playing near the railroad tracks before they vanished. Hours later, their bodies were discovered, leaving the town to wonder who could commit such a horrific crime. At the time of George Stinney Jr. was a 14-year-old black boy, and in the eyes of many in Alcolu, he was the perfect scapegoat. Just a few days later, George was arrested, and there were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence linking him to the crime. All that was left was an alleged confession, one that many believe was coerced by the police. His trial began on April 24, 1944, and it was over almost before it started. The proceedings were nothing short of a mockery of justice. In a court of law, every person is supposed to have the right to a fair trial. But for George, that right was denied. His defense attorney didn't call a single witness. The jury deliberated for just 10 minutes, and in that time, they reached a verdict: guilty. In just 3 hours, a 14-year-old child was sentenced to death by electrocution. It was a death sentence that no one could undo. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was strapped into the electric chair, still just a child. He weighed just 90 pounds and was so small that they had to use a special mask to hold his face in place. His family, devastated by the loss of their son, was denied the chance to even say goodbye. And just like that, the life of a 14-year-old boy was extinguished, without a shred of concrete evidence to prove his guilt. George was gone, the world moved on, but his story didn't end there. For 70 years, George Stinney Jr.'s case lay buried in the past, overshadowed by time and tragedy. But in 2014, everything changed. A new investigation was launched, and after reviewing all the evidence, or rather, the lack of evidence, a South Carolina judge ruled that George had never received a fair trial. His confession? It was likely forced. The trial? Flawed from start to finish. And the most important detail: no physical evidence tied him to the crime. The case that had haunted a town for decades was finally reopened. And in 2014, a judge officially overturned George Stinney Jr.'s conviction. He was posthumously exonerated for a crime he never committed. Though George was posthumously cleared, the damage was done. A child's life was lost, a family was torn apart, and the truth, the real truth, came far too late. George's case was just one tragic example of the deep flaws in a system built on racial prejudice, injustice, and inequality. His death was a miscarriage of justice, but it's not the only one. It's a reminder that innocent lives can be destroyed in an instant, and sometimes the truth doesn't come out until it's too late. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Is justice always served, or is it just a matter of who has the power to speak up?